The courthouse was never this crowded. It was a modest building, the kind that usually dealt with traffic tickets, small disputes, and the occasional family matter. But on this day, every bench was filled. Reporters squeezed into the back row, their notebooks open, pens ready. Local families gathered with expressions ranging from curiosity to outrage, whispering among themselves about the trial everyone in town was talking about. At the front of the room, the judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the crowd, his stern face giving nothing away. He had presided over hundreds of cases, but something about this one was different. This wasn't just about law. It was about whether a community could believe the smallest voice among them. The defendant sat at the defense table, dressed sharply in a dark suit that did little to hide the coldness in his eyes. His attorney leaned close, whispering strategies, occasionally smirking as if already confident of victory. Across from them sat the prosecutor, papers neatly arranged, posture tense but determined. The jurors shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. They had been warned this case would test their patience, their judgment, and their emotions. Few could have guessed that the key witness was not an officer, not an expert, not an adult at all, but a child, barely 3 years old. The murmurs grew louder until the judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court," he said firmly. "We will begin." Even the air felt heavy. It wasn't just a case. It was a test of faith and truth itself. The case involved an incident that had shaken the community. A young girl had been the only one to see what happened. The details were too grim to be shared in the newspapers, but whispers in coffee shops and church halls painted a chilling picture. Some doubted the child could remember anything reliable. Others believed that innocence had a way of cutting through lies more sharply than any adult testimony. But what everyone agreed on was this: the trial was going to hinge on her words. The defense attorney rose and addressed the jury, smiling politely. He spoke confidently about unreliable memory, imaginary thinking, and the inability of a toddler to distinguish truth from fantasy. His words carried the tone of someone who believed he was already in control. He wanted the jurors to see the child as nothing more than a scared little girl with an overactive imagination. The prosecutor, however, reminded the jury that truth often comes from the most unexpected places. He hinted that the testimony they were about to hear would not come in the way anyone imagined, but that they must listen with open hearts. Still, the tension was undeniable. In the first row, beside an officer, sat a police dog. His glossy coat and calm eyes gave him an almost regal presence. Most thought he was there simply as a comfort companion, trained to sit quietly and keep the courtroom at ease. Yet there was something about the dog and alertness in the way he held himself that suggested he knew far more than anyone else in the room. Children in the back row whispered excitedly about him, while adults cast curious glances. Why bring a police dog to a courtroom? Some thought it was symbolic. Others suspected it was practical, a way to help the child feel safe. The judge, too, glanced toward the animal, then returned his gaze to the attorneys. He was no stranger to unusual trials, but he could not ignore the strangeness of this one. The bailiff entered through a side door, leaned down, and whispered something to the judge. The judge nodded. It was time. The courtroom door creaked open, and the room fell silent. A small figure appeared, holding tightly onto her mother's hand. She was tiny, with wisps of blonde hair falling over her forehead, and a yellow dress that seemed too cheerful for the setting. In her other hand, she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, its ears nearly torn off from years of love. The jury shifted, leaning forward. Reporters clicked their pens, eager to capture every detail. Even the defense attorney, so smug before, paused for a moment, perhaps realizing that the sight of such innocence could sway hearts faster than words ever could. The little girl's eyes darted around the room. So many strange faces stared back at her. She clung closer to her mother, her bottom lip trembling. The mother, holding back tears, bent down and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Just be brave." The child nodded slowly, though fear still lingered in her gaze. Then, something remarkable happened. Her eyes landed on the police dog sitting calmly near the front. For a moment, all the fear seemed to fade. She straightened her back slightly, loosened her grip on her mother's hand, and smiled faintly. "Doggy," she whispered, her voice so soft that only those closest to her could hear. The officer by the dog gave a reassuring nod. It was the first time since entering the room that the girl looked like she belonged. And while no one could have predicted it at the time, that single glance, the child's connection with the police dog, was about to change everything that followed. But for now, tension gripped the courtroom like a vice. The judge cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said gravely, "we will hear from the witness shortly. I remind you all what you are about to see is highly unusual. This child is only 3 years old. You must listen with care, and you must remember the seriousness of this proceeding." The jurors nodded solemnly. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already preparing to dismantle whatever words the child might utter. The prosecutor, however, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the girl with something like hope. And in the benches, the townspeople whispered nervously, torn between skepticism and belief. The bailiff guided the girl and her mother toward the witness stand. Each step echoed through the courtroom like a drumbeat. She climbed onto the chair, her legs dangling far above the floor, and hugged her rabbit close to her chest. Her mother kissed her forehead, then stepped aside, standing nearby, but letting the girl face the room herself. The judge leaned forward. "Hello, young lady," he said gently. "Do you know why you're here today?" The little girl hesitated, her big eyes scanning the sea of strangers. She shook her head. The defense attorney smirked, certain this would be easy. But then the girl's gaze drifted once more to the police dog. And for reasons no one yet understood, her small shoulders relaxed. She pointed at the dog, and a spark of courage lit her face. The room froze. The child had not said a single word about the case, but already she had shifted the energy of the courtroom. Something extraordinary was about to happen. And everyone, from the jury to the reporters to the hardened judge, leaned forward, waiting for the story that was about to unfold. The courtroom had never felt so fragile. The weight of silence pressed down as the 3-year-old girl stood before everyone. The judge, the jury, the attorneys, the townspeople, each person seemed to hold their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound would frighten her away. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering encouragement into her ear. "You're safe here, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about? Just tell the truth." The girl nodded weakly, her little fingers still wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. Its tattered ears flopped against her chest, almost as though the toy itself were trembling with her. She clutched it tighter, as if drawing courage from the fabric. The prosecutor, sensing the tension, approached the stand slowly. He lowered himself to the girl's eye level, a deliberate gesture meant to reduce the looming pressure of the adults around her. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "Hello," he said softly. "My name is Mr. James. Do you know why you're here?" The little girl's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes darted nervously across the courtroom. She saw the defense attorney, glaring at her with a thin smile, the jurors watching with wary curiosity, and the reporters' pens scratching furiously on their notepads. The room was too big, the faces too many. For a child who still mixed her alphabet letters and thought bedtime stories were real, this setting was overwhelming. Her eyes welled with tears, and she leaned toward her mother again. A wave of doubt passed through the room. Some jurors exchanged glances, already questioning how this tiny witness could possibly carry such a burden. The defense attorney smirked, whispering something into his client's ear. They both chuckled quietly. The implication was clear. This trial would collapse under the weight of a child's silence. But then it happened, a moment that shifted everything. The girl's gaze drifted away from the intimidating stares of the adults. It landed instead on the dog. The police dog sat near the front, his large, dark eyes calm and steady. He didn't blink under the crowd's scrutiny. He didn't shuffle or move. He simply sat tall, a quiet guardian in the midst of chaos. The girl's trembling stopped. Her lips curled slightly into the faintest smile. "Doggy," she whispered. The word carried across the courtroom, light as a feather but powerful enough to slice through the tension. Every head turned toward the dog. The officer at his side gave a small nod, gently patting the dog's back as if to confirm his presence wasn't accidental. The judge leaned forward. "Doggy?" he repeated, his brows knitting in curiosity. The girl nodded quickly, almost eagerly no. She pointed her tiny finger directly at the animal. Doggy was there. Gasps filled the room. The defense attorney immediately shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The child is making irrelevant comments." "Overruled," the judge said firmly, his curiosity piqued. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the girl. "Can you tell us more about the dog?" The little girl swallowed hard. Her hand squeezed the rabbit tighter. And then, in the clearest voice she had spoken yet, she said, "Doggy barked when the bad man came close to me." The room erupted in murmurs. The prosecutor's eyes widened, sensing the significance. The defense attorney shook his head furiously, hissing into his client's ear. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order, order in the court." But the child wasn't finished. Her small voice continued, shaky but growing steadier with each word. "Doggy didn't like him. Doggy growled. Mommy said Doggy was trying to protect me." The jury leaned forward as one, captivated. What was meant to be a fragile, uncertain testimony had suddenly taken form. This wasn't nonsense. This was memory. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what you remember about that day?" The little girl hesitated, then glanced once more at the dog. His calm, watchful eyes seemed to assure her. She took a deep breath. The man came close. "I got scared." Doggy barked loud, like he was saying no. Then Mommy came. Her words were simple, fragmented, but their innocence made them powerful. The courtroom buzzed with energy. Jurors whispered among themselves, exchanging looks that spoke volumes. Mothers in the gallery dabbed their eyes with tissues, imagining their own children in such a terrifying position. Even the judge's stern face softened for a moment, as if he too felt the raw purity of the girl's account. The defense attorney rose again, desperate to regain control. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The child is too young to distinguish fact from imagination. She is clearly influenced by the presence of the animal." But the prosecutor quickly countered. "Your Honor, the child has made a statement directly connecting the defendant to the dog's reaction. This aligns with police records from the investigation. The jury has a right to hear it." The judge thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Objection overruled. The testimony stands." The defense attorney slumped into his seat, his confidence cracking. The girl sat quietly, swinging her legs beneath the chair. Her stuffed rabbit dangled from her grip, but she no longer clutched it with desperation. Instead, she turned her attention fully to the dog, who remained steady, almost proud. The courtroom had shifted. What began as doubt and skepticism was now charged with anticipation. The prosecutor smiled gently at the child. "You're very brave. Can you tell us what Doggy did after he barked?" The little girl's brow furrowed in concentration. Doggy barked again. Loud, the man stepped back. Doggy didn't stop looking at him. He knew. The word knew echoed like a bell through the room. It wasn't just a child's imagination. It was instinct, the kind of instinct police dogs were trained for, and the kind investigators had noted, but couldn't fully explain. And now, out of the mouth of a 3-year-old, that instinct became testimony. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "The child may continue when ready," he said, his voice softer than before. But the girl had already spoken enough to transform the atmosphere. What had seemed like a hopeless effort to put a toddler on the stand had suddenly become the most compelling testimony of the trial. The defense attorney sat frozen, realizing that the more the girl spoke, the more credibility she gained. His client's confidence faltered as well. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his composure cracking under the gaze of 12 jurors, who no longer looked at him with neutrality. The child, however, no longer noticed the defendant at all. Her world had narrowed to one simple truth. The dog had protected her. The dog had known the truth. And now, so did the jury. As the judge called a brief recess, the girl hopped down from the witness chair and rushed toward the police dog. She threw her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The photographers in the gallery scrambled to capture the image, their cameras flashing. It was a moment that would later appear on front pages across the country. A child finding safety not in lawyers or adults, but in the silent loyalty of a dog. The courtroom buzzed louder than before, but this time the energy was different. It wasn't doubt anymore. It was belief that even the smallest voice could carry the greatest weight. And as the recess ended, everyone in the room realized one thing. This trial would not be decided by technical arguments or lawyerly tricks. It would be decided by truth, and the truth had already begun to shine through the innocence of a 3-year-old child. The courtroom had grown used to silence, but this silence was different. It wasn't the stiff, uncomfortable quiet from earlier. This was a silence charged with electricity, as if everyone knew something extraordinary was about to unfold. The 3-year-old girl had just pointed at the police dog, her words clumsy but filled with meaning. Doggy barked when the bad man came close. That one sentence rattled the courtroom like thunder. Jurors leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. Parents in the gallery clasped their children's hands tighter. Even the judge, who had warned everyone to treat the testimony cautiously, found himself staring at the girl with a mixture of awe and curiosity. But the defense attorney was not impressed. He stood quickly, buttoning his suit jacket with exaggerated confidence. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "this is a child we're listening to. A toddler. Her so-called testimony cannot be considered reliable. She is clearly influenced by the presence of that dog. It's imagination, nothing more. You cannot expect a jury to accept this as fact." The judge leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Harlow," he said firmly, "you will sit down. The jury will decide what weight to give her words." Objection overruled. Gasps spread through the crowd. The defense attorney shot a venomous glance at the prosecutor, but there was nothing he could do. For the first time since the trial began, the scales seemed to tip against him. The prosecutor took a step closer to the child, his voice careful, gentle, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile courage she had found. "You said Doggy barked when the bad man came close," he repeated softly. "Can you tell us what else happened?" The girl hesitated. She fiddled with her rabbit's torn ear, her eyes flicking nervously toward the rows of strangers. The pressure of dozens of eyes on her tiny frame was overwhelming. But then, once again, her gaze landed on the dog. The dog hadn't moved. His dark eyes remained fixed, steady, as though telling her, "You're safe." Keep going. The child swallowed, then nodded. The bad man, he smiled. But Doggy didn't like him. Doggy growled, and then he barked. Loud, loud, like when thunder comes. Her words tumbled out awkwardly, but the sincerity in her tone made them sharper than any adult's testimony. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. Did the bad man do anything when Doggy barked? She bit her lip, her small hands trembling slightly. He got mad. He told me to come with him. But Doggy barked again, and Mommy came. And then the man ran. The gallery erupted in whispers. The prosecutor looked to the jury, his expression solemn. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is a child's memory. Uncoached, unpolished, and deeply genuine. This isn't fantasy. This aligns with evidence already on record. The defense attorney leapt to his feet again. This is absurd. Your Honor, I demand that this testimony be stricken from the record. She's a toddler. She doesn't even understand the meaning of truth and lies. The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. Mr. Harlow, enough. The jury will hear her out. You will have your chance to cross-examine. But even as he spoke, it was clear that the jury had already been moved. Their faces showed it some were skeptical, but many were leaning in, captivated by the sheer innocence of the girl's words. The defendant, who had sat with smug confidence for days, shifted uneasily in his chair. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward the dog, and for the first time there was fear. The prosecutor pressed on carefully, not wanting to overwhelm the child. "Sweetheart," he asked gently, "when Doggy barked at the bad man, how did that make you feel?" Her eyes flicked upward, watery but brave. Safe, like Doggy was telling me he would stop him. A ripple of emotion moved through the room. Mothers dabbed their eyes. Fathers clenched their fists in protective rage. Even one juror, a stern-looking man in his 60s, blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. The girl hugged her rabbit tighter, her small voice trembling but steady. Doggy knew he was bad. Those words hit harder than any lawyer's argument ever could. The prosecutor nodded, standing slowly. He looked at the judge. "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." The judge shifted his gaze to the defense attorney. "Mr. Harlow, you may cross-examine the witness." Harlow rose, his expression sharp and predatory. He adjusted his tie and strode toward the child, his polished shoes clicking against the courtroom floor. The little girl shrank slightly, pressing her back against the witness chair. The dog growled softly, barely audible but unmistakable. "Objection!" Harlow snapped, pointing toward the animal. "That dog is influencing her testimony. He cannot remain in this courtroom if I am to question the witness fairly." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Overruled. The dog will remain. Proceed." The defense attorney clenched his jaw, but forced a smile as he turned back to the child. He crouched slightly, though not as kindly as the prosecutor had. His voice carried an edge. "Now, young lady, you said the dog barked when the man came close. But tell me, don't dogs bark at lots of people? Don't they bark when they're scared or excited? Maybe Doggy was just playing?" The girl shook her head fiercely. "No, Doggy was mad. He barked loud because the man was bad." Her answer was instant, unshaken. The jury shifted, impressed by her certainty. Harlow tried again. "But how do you know he was bad?" "You're very little. Maybe you don't remember clearly." The girl's chin lifted, her tiny voice carrying more weight than she knew. "I remember. Doggy told me. Not with words. With barking." "I know." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs again. The prosecutor suppressed a smile. Harlow straightened, his frustration evident. He knew he was losing the jury, but he pressed on. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the room. "This is nothing more than a child's imagination. Dogs bark, children invent stories. That's all we're hearing. Nothing more." But his words rang hollow. The jurors weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the little girl, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, her eyes shining with the purity of a truth too simple to be fabricated. The judge raised his hand. "That's enough, Mr. Harlow. The witness has answered." Harlow gritted his teeth, but he had no choice but to return to his seat. The girl sat quietly for a moment, swinging her legs. The tension in the room remained, but the balance had shifted. The judge cleared his throat. "The court will take this testimony into account." His voice softened slightly. "Thank you, young lady. You've been very brave." The little girl beamed faintly, glancing one last time at the dog. She whispered, almost to herself, "Doggy knew." And with that, she climbed down from the chair, her mother rushing forward to scoop her up. The gallery erupted in hushed conversations, the story already taking on the tone of legend. What had begun as a trial built on doubt had transformed in a single moment. The unexpected had happened. A toddler, too young to read or write, had pierced through the defenses of a seasoned attorney with nothing more than honesty and a bond with a dog. The jury would not forget her words. Neither would the town. For the first time since the trial began, justice felt closer than ever. And the strangest part? It had all started with a finger pointed at a dog. The gavel struck sharply against the sound block, echoing through the hushed courtroom like a thunderclap. The judge's steady voice commanded order, but beneath that calm exterior, even he seemed rattled by what had just occurred. A 3-year-old had just pointed at a police dog and uttered words that no one in that room could forget. "Doggy knows." At first, it seemed almost comical, a phrase that might have belonged more in a nursery than in a courthouse where justice was being fought for tooth and nail. But the weight of her small voice, combined with the collective gasp of the audience, had shifted the air. It was no longer just a trial. It was a spectacle. Every eye turned toward the German shepherd sitting loyally by the officer's side, ears perked, eyes sharp, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The defense attorney stood quickly, straightening his tie, his smirk faltering as murmurs spread across the room. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We cannot place weight on the babble of a toddler. She's frightened, confused, and—" But the prosecutor interrupted, his voice calm, yet cutting like a blade through smoke. "Or perhaps, Counselor, she has just revealed the key to this entire case." He stepped closer to the jury, his gaze unwavering. That dog was present on the night of the crime. He was trained to react, to sense danger. And what did he do when the accused approached the child? He gestured dramatically toward the shepherd, who shifted but remained steady. He barked. He growled. He reacted as if he recognized a threat. The courtroom grew still again. Even those skeptical of the child's testimony could not easily dismiss a trained canine's instincts. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled. "Prosecutor, are you suggesting that this child's recollection, paired with the dog's behavior, be entered as corroborative evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied. His voice carried conviction, the kind that made jurors sit up straighter. "This dog is not just a bystander. He is an officer of the law, trained, tested, and trusted. And this child, though only 3, remembers his reaction. That is not babble. That is truth." The defense lawyer rolled his eyes dramatically, muttering something about theatrics, but his unease was showing. He shuffled his notes more than usual, tapped his pen against the table, and avoided the jury's eyes. The little girl, meanwhile, seemed to draw strength from the moment. Her small hand reached out timidly, pointing again toward the shepherd. "Doggy barked loud," she whispered. "He didn't like Bad Man." Her words, fragile but clear, cut through the tension like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. The jury members exchanged glances. Some leaned back, stunned. Others leaned forward, curiosity sharpening their features. Mothers in the gallery pressed hands to their mouths, fighting tears at the courage of such a young soul. Even seasoned reporters scribbled furiously, knowing this was the kind of moment that would become headline material. The prosecutor seized the momentum. He walked to the stand, holding up an official police report. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is the documented statement from the responding officer. That very night, Officer Rex, the canine you see here, became aggressive in the presence of the defendant. That detail, while noted, had not been explained until today. The child's memory has brought clarity. The dog recognized danger. The dog reacted to protect her. The child has now confirmed what was dismissed as incidental. The defense jumped up again. Objection. We're talking about a dog, not a detective. Are we really about to let a barking animal dictate the fate of my client? The judge eyed him sternly. Counselor, you're treading on thin ice. The testimony is not solely about the dog. It is about the consistency between the child's memory and documented police behavior. Objection overruled. The defense sat down hard, his jaw tightening. He knew the tide was shifting, and there was little he could do to stop it. The little girl's mother leaned in, whispering softly to her daughter, but the child surprised everyone by continuing on her own. Her tiny voice carried more power than anyone expected. Doggy saved me. He barked when man tried to take me. You could hear a pin drop. The accused shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat beading at his temples. For the first time since the trial began, he looked less confident, less smug. The mask was slipping. The prosecutor carefully approached the child. Sweetheart, he said gently, are you saying that the dog barked when the man who hurt you came near? She nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter. Yes, Doggy knew. And there it was, the breakthrough moment that changed everything. The court stenographer's fingers flew across the keys, capturing every syllable that could one day shape case law. The jurors' pens scribbled notes frantically, though most of them seemed to simply absorb the scene with widened eyes, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The prosecutor returned to his table, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the court. This is not just the imagination of a child. This is consistent testimony, supported by the records of a trained police dog's behavior. A child too young to fabricate such detail has confirmed what law enforcement already noted. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes truth doesn't come dressed in complexity, it comes in simplicity. And in this case, truth came from the bond between a child and a dog. Whispers broke out again in the audience. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the raw clarity of it all. Others nodded in solemn agreement. The judge tapped his gavel once more to maintain order. Proceed. The next witness was called, the dog's handler, Officer Martinez. A tall man with a commanding presence, Martinez walked with pride as his loyal partner trotted beside him. The officer placed a hand over his badge, swore his oath, and began recounting that night. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Martinez began, I've worked with Canine Rex for 6 years. He has never once misread a situation. On the night in question, when the defendant approached the child, Rex went into full alert, ears up, teeth bared, growling. He does not do that unless there is a direct threat. I had to restrain him from lunging. That behavior is consistent with what the child has just said today. His words solidified the case like concrete. The jury leaned in further. The defense slumped deeper in his chair, and the accused seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. It wasn't just a 3-year-old anymore. It wasn't just a dog. It was the undeniable intersection of innocence and instinct, memory and training, courage and truth. And in that moment, the courtroom no longer doubted. They believed. The weight of what was unfolding was clear to all. This wasn't just a trial, it was history in the making. The silence in the courtroom stretched longer than anyone expected. The last words spoken by Officer Martinez, confirming that Rex the police dog had indeed gone on full alert in the suspect's presence, still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The jurors looked shaken, the defense lawyer looked pale, and the accused shifted uneasily in his seat, his arrogance wearing thinner by the second. Then the judge turned his eyes back to the child. "Do you feel ready to continue, young lady?" His voice, though stern by habit, softened in her direction. Everyone understood they were treading on fragile ground. The girl was only 3 years old, a baby in the eyes of many. Yet here she was, holding the thread of justice in her tiny hands. She nodded faintly, her stuffed rabbit still clutched to her chest. The court seemed to collectively lean closer, drawn into the moment as if watching the unfolding of a sacred truth. The prosecutor stepped forward with practiced patience. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rush. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "can you tell us what you remember about that night?" The girl blinked, her wide eyes glistening. For a second, she buried her face in her mother's sleeve. Murmurs rose in the gallery. Some worried she'd retreat into silence. But then, like a candle flame flickering to life, she peeked out, her gaze sliding toward Rex. The dog's steady presence calmed her trembling lips. "Bad man came," she said, her voice no louder than a whisper. A ripple passed through the courtroom. The defense lawyer immediately rose, muttering objection, but the judge overruled before the word fully landed. "Overruled. Continue." The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. "The bad man came. And then what happened?" Her tiny hands fidgeted with the rabbit's ears. He wanted to take me." Her voice quivered. "I was scared." The child's mother began to cry quietly, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. A few jurors visibly stiffened, their pens frozen above their notepads. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth, muffling a gasp. "And what did you do when he tried to take you?" the prosecutor asked softly. The little girl's eyes darted again to Rex. Her voice grew stronger, steadier, as though she were borrowing his courage. "Doggy barked, loud. He scared bad man. He growled. Like this." She bared her tiny teeth, imitating Rex, and for a brief second, the tension cracked into a bittersweet chuckle from the audience. Even the judge's lips twitched. But the gravity of her words pressed down quickly again. The child lowered her voice. "Doggy, he kept me safe. He didn't like bad man. He knew." The prosecutor gave her a soft smile. "And do you remember what the bad man did when Rex barked?" Her small face scrunched in thought. "He got mad. He said bad words. Then he ran." She hugged her rabbit tighter. "I was so scared." The weight of the statement fell heavily on the room. Everyone knew that fear couldn't be faked, not in the voice of a child that young. There was no script, no manipulation, just raw memory painted with the innocence of truth. The defense attorney jumped to his feet again. "Your Honor, this testimony is unreliable. She's 3 years old. She could be parroting stories told by her mother or the police. Children that age imagine things. We cannot allow this to sway the jury." "Sit down, counselor," the judge barked, his patience thinning. "The jury will decide what to make of her words." Objection denied. The defense sat, fuming, but the damage was already done. His protests only made him appear desperate. The jury was no longer looking at him. They were watching the girl, and every one of them seemed to silently urge her on. The prosecutor stepped closer again. "You're doing very well," he reassured her. "Just a few more questions. Can you tell us what the bad man looked like?" The courtroom went silent again. Every eye turned toward the child, and flickered to the defendant. She blinked at the man across the room. For a moment, she seemed to shrink into her mother's side. But then, with a trembling hand, she raised her finger and pointed. "That man," she whispered. "That's the bad man." Gasps erupted across the courtroom. The defendant shifted violently in his chair, his lawyer placing a hand on his arm to keep him from reacting further. The judge banged the gavel repeatedly. Order, order in the court. But even his commanding voice could barely cut through the emotional chaos. The prosecutor's voice returned steady and calm. "You're certain, sweetheart? You're sure it was him?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide, filled with tears that didn't fall. "Doggy didn't like him. I remember. It was him." The jury exchanged glances, their expressions telling a silent story of belief. One man rubbed his temple. Another woman scribbled furiously in her notebook, but their eyes betrayed it. They were convinced. The child's mother sobbed openly now, clutching her daughter, whispering soothing words. The room seemed to swell with collective emotion. Anger at the accused, sorrow for the child, and awe at her bravery. Even seasoned officers sitting in the gallery looked moved, their hardened expressions softened by the purity of the moment. For years they had relied on evidence, on facts, on testimony from adults who knew how to twist words. Yet here was a child 3 years old delivering truth with a simplicity no lawyer could tarnish. The defense lawyer tried again, his voice cracking with strain. "Your Honor, we must strike this from the record." "She's been coached, manipulated." The judge cut him off sharply. "Enough, counselor. I warned you before. This court will not dismiss the voice of a victim simply because of her age. You will not intimidate this child." The defense slumped back, defeated for the moment. The prosecutor straightened, turning back toward the jury. His voice carried an emotional weight that needed no theatrics. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is the unfiltered truth. A child barely old enough to form full sentences has stood before you and recalled with perfect consistency what happened. She remembered the dog's reaction, she remembered her fear, and she remembered the man who tried to take her. You cannot ignore her innocence, because innocence has no agenda. She spoke the truth because that's all she knows how to do." Some jurors nodded. Others simply stared, but it was clear the testimony had pierced through their doubt. As the court recessed for the day, the little girl was led gently from the stand. But before leaving, she paused. Her tiny feet shuffled back toward Rex. Without hesitation, she wrapped her little arms around the shepherd's neck. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply leaned into her, his steady eyes glancing across the courtroom like a silent protector. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled madly, but the image was burned into everyone's memory long before the ink dried. The mother mouthed a tearful thank you to the dog's handler. The officer nodded, his jaw set, clearly as moved as anyone else. And in that moment, the weight of the trial wasn't about arguments or legalities. It was about the bond between innocence and loyalty, between a child and a dog who had saved her in more ways than one. The court may have still been deciding the outcome, but in the hearts of everyone who sat in that room, the truth was already crystal clear. Justice had found its voice, and it came from the trembling lips of a 3-year-old girl who dared to speak, and from the silent strength of a dog who barked when it mattered most. The courthouse hallways buzzed during recess. Reporters rushed to phones, typing furiously on laptops, their headlines practically writing themselves. 3-year-old points to police dog in court. Toddler identifies suspect. Police canine confirms threat. The public hadn't even heard the full story yet, but word was spreading like wildfire. Inside the courtroom, though, the air remained charged, thick with anticipation. When the session reconvened, the jurors returned to their seats, their expressions hardened with focus. They had witnessed the raw courage of a child, but now it was time for the adults, the investigators, the officers, to piece together the puzzle with cold, factual precision. The judge cleared his throat. "Prosecution, you may call your next witness." The prosecutor stood tall, adjusting his tie before speaking. "The state calls Detective Laura Henderson." A woman in her early 40s approached the stand, her blazer crisp, her expression composed. She raised her hand, swore her oath, and sat. Henderson was known for her tenacity. In her years on the force, she had unraveled some of the most complex cases in the county. The jurors seemed to perk up at her presence, sensing she was about to drop a weight of truth that could not be ignored. "Detective Henderson," the prosecutor began, "were you the lead investigator on the night of the alleged incident involving the child and the defendant?" "Yes, I was," she replied, her voice steady. "Tell us what you observed." Henderson adjusted her papers before speaking. "We received a 911 call from the child's mother, who reported a man attempting to lure her daughter away from the front yard. Officers arrived on the scene within minutes. The defendant was identified nearby. What stood out immediately was the behavior of our K-9 unit, Rex. When the defendant approached the officers, Rex displayed aggressive behavior, ears back, growling, barking, teeth exposed. It was documented in my initial report." The prosecutor walked slowly toward the jury. "So, this wasn't an afterthought. You actually included the dog's reaction in your official report that very night?" "Yes. At the time, we considered it unusual, but not conclusive. However, given the child's testimony today, the consistency is undeniable." The jury scribbled notes, some nodding as they connected the dots. The defense attorney jumped up. "Objection. This is speculative. A detective is inferring connections after the fact." But Henderson didn't falter. "With respect, counselor, I am stating facts as they were observed and recorded." The judge nodded. "Overruled. Continue." The prosecutor leaned in, his voice measured. "Detective, did you also gather statements from neighbors that night?" "Yes," she said, flipping through her file. "Several neighbors reported hearing a child scream, followed immediately by a dog barking loudly. One neighbor stated she saw the defendant fleeing when the barking grew intense." These accounts were included in our witness statements. The gallery buzzed with murmurs again. The narrative was crystallizing, piece by piece, from multiple directions. The prosecutor turned to the jury, his voice low but commanding. "So, to recap, we have a 3-year-old witness, a police canine's instinctual reaction, and neighbors corroborating both the scream of a child and the defendant's flight from the scene. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is aligning itself in ways no fabrication ever could." The defense lawyer practically leapt from his chair. "This is outrageous. You're piecing together coincidence as though it's destiny. A dog barked, a child cried, these things happen. My client was merely in the area." But before he could continue, the prosecutor raised a hand. "Coincidence, counselor? Or consistency?" His words cut sharply, silencing the defense mid-sentence. Detective Henderson looked directly at the jury. "I've worked over 100 cases. Children can be mistaken. Witnesses can misremember. But when a child, a police dog, and multiple witnesses tell the same story without ever speaking to one another, that's not coincidence. That's the truth." Her words landed like a hammer on stone. The next witness called was Officer Martinez again, Rex's handler. This time, the prosecutor drilled deeper. "Officer, explain to the jury how Rex is trained to react in situations involving potential threats." Martinez placed his large hand gently on Rex's back, who sat obediently at his side. "Rex is trained to remain neutral unless there's a clear sign of aggression or danger. He does not bark at random passers-by. He reacts only when he senses a threat, whether through body language, tone of voice, or intent. And on the night in question, Martinez's jaw tightened. The defendant approached. Rex immediately tensed, then barked and growled. I had to restrain him to prevent an attack. That behavior is consistent with identifying a threat. The prosecutor let the words hang for a moment before turning back to the jury. So, Rex reacted aggressively only to the defendant, and no one else present that night? Correct, Martinez confirmed. The defense lawyer rose again, trying desperately to regain control. Dogs are animals. They bark at shadows, at smells, at strangers. We can't assign meaning to every bark. But Martinez's reply was calm, unwavering. With respect, counselor, this dog has more hours of training than most rookie officers. His instincts are trusted in bomb detection, narcotic searches, and suspect apprehension. His reaction wasn't random. It was precise. The jury seemed captivated not just by the testimony, but by Rex himself. The shepherd sat tall, his gaze unblinking, his composure almost human. To many in that room, he wasn't just a dog, he was an officer, a guardian, a hero. The prosecutor's next move sealed the weight of the testimony. He displayed a photograph on the courtroom screen. It showed Rex on the night of the incident, his fur raised, his teeth bared, his handler straining to keep him back. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The jurors leaned forward, the image burning into their minds. This, the prosecutor said, his voice steady, is not the reaction of an animal to a harmless passerby. This is the instinct of a trained officer of the law protecting a child from danger. The child remembered it. The neighbors witnessed it. And the defendant ran because of it. The room was silent, except for the faint scratching of pens across paper. The defense lawyer sat slumped, his arguments shrinking with every revelation. The accused looked smaller too, his bravado eroded, his eyes darting nervously toward the jury box. Detective Henderson delivered the final blow in her testimony. The simplest explanation, she said firmly, is usually the correct one. And the simplest explanation here is this. The child is telling the truth. The dog confirmed it. The neighbors confirmed it. The evidence aligns. Anything else would be bending reality to protect a guilty man. It was a masterstroke. The judge finally announced a recess, his gavel striking firmly. We'll adjourn until tomorrow morning. Court is dismissed. The jurors filed out, their expressions solemn. The gallery erupted into chatter, reporters rushing to file their pieces. The mother hugged her daughter tightly, whispering words of comfort, while the child, ever innocent, simply looked at Rex and smiled. She bent down, stroked his fur, and whispered something only he could hear. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a silent affirmation. As the defendant was escorted out by officers, his shoulders sagging, one thing was clear. The walls were closing in. The case that once seemed fragile, hinging on the testimony of a toddler, was now fortified by the unshakable testimony of seasoned investigators and the undeniable instinct of a police dog. And the jury? They weren't just leaning toward belief anymore. They were convinced. The trial was far from over, but the breakthrough had arrived. The truth wasn't just whispered by a child. It was now etched into the record by the very officers sworn to uphold the law. The defendant's fate was no longer a question of if. It was a question of when. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. After hours of emotional testimony, photographic evidence, and the fragile but piercing words of a 3-year-old child, the case had reached its final chapter. Everyone knew the stakes. One man's freedom hung in the balance. One child's truth balanced against years of a defense lawyer's training. And sitting silently at the heart of it all was Rex, the police dog whose instincts had become as pivotal as any witness's words. The judge's gavel struck once. Closing arguments will now be heard. The prosecutor rose first. His movements were calm, deliberate, as though every step carried the weight of the child's courage. He stood before the jury, his eyes sweeping across their faces. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past week, you've heard testimony from officers, neighbors, and experts. But the most powerful voice in this courtroom wasn't mine, or Detective Henderson's, or even Officer Martinez's. It came from a child. He paused, letting the words settle. 3 years old. Too young to understand manipulation, too innocent to fabricate. Her words were simple, but they were true. Doggy barked. Doggy didn't like the bad man. The prosecutor turned toward Rex, who sat alert at Martinez's feet. And Rex, a trained canine officer, confirmed it. His instincts, honed over years of service, are trusted to find explosives, narcotics, and dangerous suspects. That night, he reacted not to shadows, not to the wind, but to this man. He pointed directly at the defendant, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Because he posed a danger to a child. The jurors leaned in, their attention captured. This case is not complicated, the prosecutor continued. It's about consistency. The child, the dog, the neighbors, they all told the same story without ever speaking to one another. And that story points to one conclusion. The defendant is guilty. He tried to take her. He was stopped by the courage of a dog and the bravery of a child. Now it falls to you to protect her, to ensure justice is served. His final words rang like a verdict themselves. Believe the child. Believe the truth. The prosecutor sat, his calm composure masking the fire that burned in every word he delivered. The defense lawyer stood next, his suit slightly wrinkled, his confidence clearly rattled. He cleared his throat, shuffling papers he no longer needed. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice thinner than before. You've been asked to convict a man based on the words of a toddler and the bark of a dog. This is not how justice is supposed to work. Children can be influenced. Dogs react to strangers. There is no hard evidence, no video, no DNA, no fingerprints that places my client at the scene. He glanced at the defendant, who stared back at him with a mixture of desperation and anger. The lawyer pressed on. I urge you to separate emotion from fact. Don't let tears or sympathy guide your judgment. Look at the law. And the law says you must convict only when guilt is proven beyond reasonable doubt. His words hung weakly, like smoke that quickly dissipates. The jury's faces were unmoved. Some scribbled notes, others crossed their arms, their expressions unreadable but heartened. When he sat, the silence was almost cruel. The judge gave final instructions, his voice steady and formal. Then came the words everyone had been waiting for. The jury will now retire to deliberate. The 12 jurors filed out, their expressions solemn, leaving the courtroom in an uneasy quiet. The audience whispered among themselves, reporters scribbled furiously, and the mother clutched her daughter, whispering prayers no one else could hear. The defendant sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously toward the closed door where the jury had vanished. Time slowed. Minutes stretched into hours. Every tick of the courtroom clock sounded like a hammer strike. People shifted in their seats, sighed, whispered, but the tension never broke. Even Rex seemed to sense the gravity, lying calmly at Martinez's feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never closing. In the jury room, 12 strangers sat around a long oak table. Their notes were spread before them, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and determination. A woman in her 50s spoke first. I don't think there's much to debate. The child was clear. The dog was clear. The neighbors backed it up. A younger man leaned back, arms crossed. I agree. It was powerful, but we need to be careful. She's 3 years old. Can we really base a conviction on her words? An older juror, a retired teacher, leaned forward. Children that young don't invent details like that. Did you see her? She wasn't performing. She was remembering. And it lined up with every piece of evidence. Another juror nodded. And the photo of Rex that night? You could see it. That dog was protecting her. You can't fake that. One by one, they spoke. The doubts were raised, but the answers always pointed in the same direction. The child's innocence, Rex's reaction, the defendant's attempt to flee, it all wove together into a tapestry of guilt. Finally, the foreman stood. Let's take a vote. Hands raised, one after another. Unanimous. Back in the courtroom, the doors creaked open. The jury filed in, their faces grave. The gallery held its breath. The defendant gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The child sat quietly on her mother's lap, her rabbit still clutched tightly, her eyes innocent and unaware of the storm about to break. The foreman rose, a sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hands. The judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Please read it." The room went still. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The words detonated in the room. Gasps, sobs, and cries erupted all at once. The mother broke down, clutching her daughter in tears of relief. The prosecutor exhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a brief second before nodding firmly. The defense lawyer slumped, his face gray with defeat. The defendant cursed under his breath, banging a fist against the table before officers restrained him. But amid the chaos, one image stood out. The little girl slid off her mother's lap, toddled toward Rex, and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. The dog leaned into her embrace, calm and steady as ever, his tail thumping once against the floor. The jury, the judge, the gallery, everyone watched in silence, their hearts gripped by the raw poetry of the moment. The gavel struck. Order. Order in the court. The judge called, though even his commanding tone carried warmth now. The verdict has been delivered. Justice has been served. As the defendant was led away in shackles, his once smug expression shattered, the gallery erupted into applause. It was rare, almost unheard of, but the judge allowed it. Some moments were larger than decorum. The verdict wasn't just a legal decision. It was a triumph of innocence over deceit, of instinct over manipulation, of courage over fear. And at the center of it all was a child who had dared to speak and a dog who had dared to protect. For the little girl, the trial was over. She didn't understand laws or verdicts, only that the bad man wouldn't hurt her anymore. She nestled against Rex, whispering, "Good doggy," as cameras flashed, capturing the unforgettable image that would soon sweep the nation. The courtroom had delivered justice. But history would remember the day not as the trial of a criminal, but as the moment a child's whisper and a dog's bark became louder than any defense. The gavel's echo still lingered in the minds of everyone present, but outside the courthouse, the world had already begun to change. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones stretched forward like eager hands trying to capture a piece of history. The case had captured the nation's attention from the very beginning, but now, with the guilty verdict delivered, it exploded into headlines that spread coast to coast. 3-year-old and police dog bring predator to justice. Toddler's innocence and K9. Heroism seal landmark case. Those were the words splashed across newspapers and scrolled on TV tickers by evening. News anchors replayed the footage of the child's testimony again and again, her small hand pointing at the dog, her tiny voice trembling but steady. The image of her hugging Rex after the verdict became iconic overnight, printed in magazines, framed on office walls of police departments, and even painted as a mural by a local artist who declared, "This isn't just about one case, it's about hope." But for the family, the media frenzy was a storm they had no interest in basking under. The mother, relieved beyond measure, wanted nothing more than to take her daughter home, to close the door to reporters, to rebuild a life without fear. That evening, she tucked the child into bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "It's over, sweetheart. He can't hurt you anymore." The little girl, clutching her stuffed rabbit and Rex's collar tag that Officer Martinez had given her as a keepsake, asked softly, "Doggy safe now?" Her mother smiled through tears. "Yes, baby. Doggy's safe, and so are you." Rex, lying just outside the bedroom door, thumped his tail once as though in agreement. A ripple across America. The trial had ended, but its impact was only beginning. Across the United States, conversations sparked about the power of child testimony and the unique role service animals could play in courtrooms. Lawmakers debated new policies, allowing trained dogs to accompany vulnerable children during testimony, funding more canine units, and providing better protection for young witnesses. For many, the story wasn't about the crime, it was about the bravery. The idea that a 3-year-old, too young to understand the complexities of law, had spoken with such clarity and consistency was astonishing. Psychologists gave interviews explaining how children that young rarely fabricate detailed stories, especially when paired with emotional or sensory memory like the presence of a dog. Police departments nationwide saw a surge in applications for canine training programs. Officers cited Rex as proof that a dog's loyalty and instincts could make the difference not just in investigations, but in courtrooms where the truth needed support. And for the public, weary from endless headlines about corruption and tragedy, this story was a reminder of something pure, that innocence still had power, that justice could still be won by the smallest voices. The defendant's fate, the man convicted, was sentenced to decades in prison. When the judge delivered the sentence, he stated firmly, "You preyed on the most vulnerable among us. Your actions will never again endanger a child." The words were met with applause in the courtroom. For the defendant, prison meant obscurity. He would be remembered only as the villain in a story where a child and a dog triumphed. Reporters tried to chase his family for comment, but most refused to speak, ashamed of his actions and unwilling to defend him. Healing and hope months passed. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal for the little girl and her mother. Therapy sessions helped the child process what had happened, but her bond with Rex became her greatest comfort. She visited the police station often, greeted like a celebrity by officers who had followed her case closely. Each time, Rex would bound toward her with unmistakable joy, and she would giggle as though the world had never held danger at all. Her mother noticed the change too. Where once her daughter woke screaming from nightmares, she now slept soundly, knowing the bad man was gone. Where once she trembled around strangers, she now waved at neighbors, holding Rex's paw like a hand. The bond between child and dog became so strong that eventually, after long discussions, the department made a decision. When Rex retired from active service, he would be given to the little girl's family permanently. "He belongs with her," Officer Martinez explained. They saved each other. The announcement brought more tears, more headlines, more admiration from the public. It felt like the story had come full circle. A nation-inspired schools began using the story in lessons about bravery and honesty. Teachers would show the courtroom clip, and children would talk about why telling the truth matters. Some schools even invited police canine units for demonstrations, calling it the Rex program, designed to teach kids about safety and trust. Nonprofits raised funds for child advocacy programs under the banner of the girl's courage. Banners read, "If she could speak, so can you." And slowly, but unmistakably, the case transformed into a movement. Years later, the years passed, and the little girl grew older. By the time she turned 8, Rex was officially retired, living full-time with her family. He had grown gray around the muzzle, slower in his steps, but his protective instincts never wavered. Every night, He curled up beside her bed, his breathing a lullaby that carried her into peaceful dreams. On her 10th birthday, she stood on a stage at her school, invited to speak at an assembly about courage. She was shy at first, her voice small, but then she looked at Rex sitting proudly beside her, tail wagging slowly. With new confidence, she said, "When I was little, something scary happened. But I wasn't alone. My doggy was there, and he helped me be brave. I told the truth, and the bad man went away. So if you're scared, you can still be brave too. Just tell the truth." The audience erupted in applause. Teachers wiped away tears. Her mother, sitting in the front row, clutched her hands together in pride. That night, the girl whispered into Rex's ear, "We did it, didn't we?" The old dog licked her cheek, his eyes shining with the quiet wisdom only animals seem to carry. The story that never faded, even decades later, long after Rex had passed peacefully and the girl had grown into a strong, confident woman, the story lived on. Documentaries were made, books were written, and every year around the anniversary of the verdict, local stations would replay the footage of the child hugging Rex in the courtroom. She herself went on to work in child advocacy, dedicating her life to protecting others the way she had once been protected. At conferences, she would smile gently when people asked if the story was true. "Yes," she would say, "it really happened. I was that little girl, and Rex was my hero." Her words always drew standing ovations, because by then, it wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever doubted their own strength, to every child who needed to believe that even small voices could be heard, and to every officer who believed in the bond between humans and dogs. Epilogue: the case became more than a headline, it became folklore. The day a toddler and a police dog stood in a courtroom, and together, without understanding law or procedure, changed the course of justice. And though years blurred the details, one image remained crystal clear in the memory of a nation. A tiny girl wrapping her arms around a dog, whispering, "Good doggy," while the world stood still and realized that courage comes in all sizes.